Welcome back to Medical Experts in Football. I'm Taiwo Adeshikbin, and today's guest, my friend, is a South African who's pretty much lived with baboons. Kind of crazy, right? But before you get all freaked out, he is a human that works with humans and their minds. He's worked in high-level competitions from Olympics and World Cups. Not to mention, he has been a part of 2 Champion League titles. He says he has no days off, but somehow he managed to write a book called 10 Rules for Talking, an expert's guide to mastering difficult conversations. You can purchase this book on Amazon. Sit back and hear how luck and preparation landed this sports psychologist a job in the Premier League. I welcome you, Tim Harkness. He leads the sports medicine and psychology department for Chelsea FC in West London. So I saw that you grew up in Durban, South Africa. How
Yes.
would you describe that city for those that have never been there before?
I'll say a couple of things. I mean, the first is I'm a white South African. So I grew up in an extremely strange world because I grew up under apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a significant part of my upbringing. And, I think sometimes you can look back on that world and you can think, how can a world like that ever existed? And when I tell my contemporaries, my younger contemporaries, some of the things that I grew up with, that they just can't believe what I'm talking about. But,
Mm-hmm.
so as a South African, probably I'd almost say more than anything, it was that upbringing that was quite an interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
But then Durban itself is a coastal city on the east coast of South Africa. It's got good surf, it's got lovely beaches, and it's got beautiful weather. It's a good place to live, and
Yeah,
I miss it now that I live in London.
I'm sure. Now, if you don't mind me going back, what were some of those challenging aspects for you growing up, and how did that impact just your life moving forward to what you do now?
Well, the challenge wasn't mine. I was one of the privileged ones. Though the challenge was knowing that you were living in a society that was not a just society. And the challenge was also knowing that you were going to have to change because that society was not a sustainable society. I think, and that change kind of coincided with me moving from being a teenager into an adult. And for sure, people were afraid of that change. People knew that the change had to happen for a couple of reasons. The one is that it had to happen because it is important for societies to be just, because societies that are not just are not peaceful societies. And it's worse for everybody, winners and losers, when you live in a society that is not a peaceful or just society.
Yeah.
So, everybody knew that, but even so, people were kind of scared of change.
Mm-hmm.
But we survived it.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you talked about nice weather, and you're
Yes.
now in London with the brutal winters. Have you adjusted to that after all these years?
Yeah, a little bit,
Yeah.
not completely.
What's the temperature like right now? Because you're wearing
Right
a sweater
now,
there.
right now it's 13 degrees centigrade.
Oh my gosh. Well, you were also an ex-squash player, and I know nothing about squash. What other sports did you play growing up?
Well, I'm actually a current squash player. I still, in fact,
Oh,
we just had our first competitive match back after the pandemic
uh-huh.
last night. So
Nice.
that was a return to squash after 18 months.
So you're probably pretty sore sitting here right now.
Yeah, there are a couple of aches and pains. Yeah, so I played squash. I cycled a lot. I got really into cycle sport, and then surfing was. Those are my 3 kind of great loves.
Wow. So do you think you still remember how to surf being in London?
I went surfing a little while ago. I hadn't surfed for probably 8 years, and I hadn't forgot it all.
For someone like me that is very nervous to be in the ocean and has never surfed before, is it too late to learn?
No, it's not.
It's not.
And I would encourage you to try it because I've been fortunate to work in a lot of different sports, and all sports are beautiful. I think any time a human being gets good at something, expresses that skill, I think that's wonderful. But surfing is a very, very beautiful sport, and it's an exhilarating sensation to stand on
Interesting.
water. That's really what it is. So I'd encourage you to
I'm
have a go.
sure.
And the
It's just
great
the
thing about
thought of falling into that water is
it,
also very daunting for many like me.
well, you can do it in big waves and you can do it in small waves. So,
Okay. Well, when I come to South Africa, I'll get my surfboard and I'll make sure you fly down so you can
okay,
be
okay,
my
that
guide.
sounds good. That sounds like a deal. Yeah.
Well, where does soccer fit in? Because now you've been working for a professional soccer club for so many years. How did
Yes.
you even come to enjoy soccer?
I was always a soccer fan. And in fact, I worked for one of the clubs in Durban, but I wasn't full time. And then just pretty much out of the blue, I got a job offer to come across to London and work full time in professional football. Which was a major culture shock in terms of being full time in soccer, and also a culture shock of having moved countries as well. So I'm gradually getting over it.
Yeah. And we're going to get to that. But before we do that, I know that you've worked during World Cups, Olympics, and at many high level events. But what is your most memorable soccer event you've been a part of?
I think professionally, I think Champions League. Personally, I coached my son when he was little, and I have some very, very happy memories. I think that's a special memory, and I think, I mean, I'm thinking about an under 18, and
Mhm.
even though these kids are so little, they've still got the ability to try.
Yeah.
And I remember once I coached a team and they won every single game in the whole season, but the one team, the one match they were drawing 1-1, and there was only maybe 60 seconds left on the clock.
Mhm.
And the whistle was about to blow for them to go and play the last 60 seconds. And I looked at these three little forwards, and these are kids who are 8 years old,
Mhm.
and they've got 60 seconds to go and score a goal to preserve this all winning record. And those three little boys were shaking with
Aw.
eagerness to go and play.
Ah,
And and then they
that's
did score.
awesome.
And I just think, that for me is a happy memory at least.
Yeah. Well, you said the Champions League title was a memorable one this past year. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. So while I've worked at the club, we won it twice. The first time was in 2012. Yeah, that was a special occasion, and then the most recent one.
Yeah. Well, you have to paint a picture because many of us in the States have never been to either Stanford or any of these big time stadiums, but watching on TV, we feel that electrifying feeling when the celebrations are going off. What was going through your mind and how were you feeling on the sideline?
At that stage, you're a fan because you've done all your work. So, you're sitting in this. I mean, well, at least I am. There are other people who are still kind of doing their jobs, the analysts and the coaches and so on. But at that stage, I'm a fan. Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, it's just special to be there with your friends, to be there with your friends and your colleagues and watch a great game of football and share it with you know, with your friends.
Yeah. Well, what did your celebration look like? Did you get up out your seat like, or were you just like, oh my
Everybody
gosh, I
gets a
can't
hug.
believe this?
Everybody gets a hug.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that. I mean, yeah, I think that's really the thing. And in fact, I've got a photograph of myself and one colleague that we took in 2012
Hmm.
of him and me celebrating together.
Oh.
And then I said to him before we went to the next final, I said, we're going to get exactly the same photograph.
And you
And
guys
we
got
took,
it?
yes, yes. And the only difference is that 9 years later, we're a little closer together. You can see
Oh.
the,
Well, that closeness, I'm sure it came with some challenging aspects during that season. What were some of those moments that you guys had to overcome to be gelling so well at the end of that season?
well, it probably wasn't even the season. It's the 9 years. I mean, obviously, I'm a little restricted in what I can talk about kind of internally, but I would say I think when you work with people for that long, it helps if you're a close person. It helps if you have personal relationships, and we do. I mean, this is someone that I care about. He's a friend,
Hmm.
and in fact, I would say, most of the people that I work with. I mean, now that I've been at this organization for a long time, we've become friends. So I think that is something that is useful, and then maybe on the kind of professional side, we're quite rigorous and demanding of each other. We are allowed to disagree, so we are allowed to challenge each other and bring new ideas and accept or reject those. Yeah, and maybe because we know we're friends, and I mean, just the other day, this particular colleague, it was his birthday, and he was on the phone. So I didn't even get to say anything to him. I just went and gave him a hug and walked off, and and that's kind of that.
Now, how important do you think it is for medical professionals to understand that it's okay to not agree, but to eventually come to an agreement when it comes to managing a team, a group of players?
Yeah, I think that's enormously important. I wrote a book on communication, 10 rules
And
of
we're going to get to that. I'm
Yeah.
excited.
And one of the ideas in that book is when you and I disagree, I'm not trying to get you to agree with me, and you shouldn't be trying to get me to agree with you. We're both trying to find the truth. So we're both trying to collaborate. While we may have different opinions, and you would hope for different opinions, we're trying to work together as a team to find almost that third position, which is the truth, rather than me pulling you towards me or you pulling me towards you.
I know I'm going to talk about this towards the end, but when it comes to players growing up in different countries, having different sets of beliefs about certain things, can you really get one another going along that same path when it comes to at a young age, this is what they've always known? How do you actually, what does that even look like?
Well, with experienced athletes
Hmm.
and with successful athletes, I really want to respect the athlete and I want to respect their opinion. So if an athlete says to me, this is what works for them, I'm going to listen and I'm going to pay attention to that. I've worked with Olympic athletes, I've worked with amateur athletes, and even amateur athletes. My hobby is I coach amateur cyclists, and I take them seriously. I listen to what they say because I think these are people who do know their body. In terms of kind of cultural differences, yeah, I think that's almost more sort of understanding different communication styles rather than necessarily having an end point. But I think however carefully we do this, and whatever different kind of cultural norms we're dealing with, I think every culture has ways of seeking discussion and seeking consensus. And if you're Korean, for example, it might be different from how you do it if you're South African or if you're American.
Hmm.
But I think each one has a particular language and way of.
Yeah. And I imagine it comes back to it kind of spending time with each other to come to understand that too.
Well, I spent some time with the Saudi national soccer team, and they actually said to me they were giving me the job as psychologist because I came from a multicultural, and they said you're probably going to be able to adapt more quickly than someone who's only really been exposed to one culture. And having worked in cricket in India, for example, they're just different ways of really expressing disagreement or voicing a different idea or challenging authority.
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
because I think those are things that which have quite strong kind of cultural precedent.
Hmm. Yeah. Now, your work with the Saudi Arabia national team, why did you feel the need to go? I know they felt that you'd be a good candidate, but
Yeah.
what did you feel?
My first thought was I'd really been looking to some time off. So they phoned me up and said, would I like to do the job? And my instant was, no, forget it. And then I thought this could be a whole new adventure. And it was, it was an opportunity to work with a culture that I had no experience. I got to go to Saudi Arabia, which not many people do. And I got to immerse myself in a group of people for probably a couple of months in total, live with inside another culture and
Hmm.
get to know a group of young men. And of course, got to go to a World Cup and watch a
Oh,
World
yeah.
Cup, which was a great adventure as well.
What was something about that culture that helped you within your personal growth, not just your professional career?
What I would say, and like I said, I'm South African and I grew up in a strange country, but I've had the opportunity to work a lot in India, a little bit in Hong Kong, in the US, all over Europe, and then I had this opportunity to work in this very, very different culture. And of all the cultures I've ever come across, the Saudi culture is probably as kind of different from the average. But the interesting thing is that I felt people are the same. Cultures are different, but people are the same. And once you get through the fact that in some cultures, greetings are smiley, in other cultures, greetings are calm. In some cultures, you speak loudly, in other cultures you speak softly. But once you get through all those superficial differences, when you're actually having like one-on-one conversations with, then they're the same. All people want the same thing.
Yeah.
And that was, it was just interesting that, for sure, it's a Saudi national team, blah, blah, blah. But they're footballers and they want the same thing as all footballers all over the world.
Yeah.
To
compete in. Exactly. But you said that Saudi Arabia, that place was just so much different. What was exactly different about their culture?
Very, very hierarchical, and nobody challenges authority.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
They've got a king and they've got a prince, and you do not mess with them. And nobody messes with the guy above him. So you don't challenge him, you don't question him.
Well, let's talk about Chelsea, because I know many people tuning in are curious. What's life like for you? How did you even decide to work in psychology? Just to open it up, how did you come to realize you wanted to pursue a career in psychology?
Well, I was a squash player at school, and I struggled to cope with pressure. And I lost a big match that I should have won. I thought to myself, I'd love to figure out why this happens. That was part of it. Part of it was always been interested in sport, and I'm interested in what makes people good at sport. I remember as a teenager thinking to myself, what does it take to cope with extreme pressure? What enables somebody to cope with this much pressure? Do you have to be a little bit crazy to be able to cope with the pressure? Or do you have to be not crazy in order to be able to cope with the pressure? I was kind of curious about which one it was.
And what did you find?
Not crazy.
Not crazy. Well, I know you obtained your bachelor's, you went on to do a master's. What was your area of study?
So my master's is actually in psychology.
Master's is in psychology. And this same master's degree, you studied the behavior of baboons, is that correct? Well, I need to know, because I'm scared of wildlife. What was that experience like? And if you can recall, take me through what it even looked like.
So basically the idea that I was studying is that there's a big game reserve in South Africa called the Kruger National Park. And in that national park, there are predators, lions and leopards and that kind of thing. And there was an understanding that when baboons move around in their troop, the big males arrange themselves on the outside to protect the females and the juvenile. And there was interest to know, in the Drakensberg Mountains, where there aren't as many leopards and there are no lions, would they still move around in the same formation, or would they move around in another formation? And it was my job to go and study who hung out with who, who sat next to who walked next to who. That was my job.
Like humans.
Well,
pretty much.
I mean, I was doing this research before reality shows came. When I started watching reality TV shows, I was thinking to myself, I've seen all of this before,
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, observing that, how do you think that helped you seeing people?
Baboons are very strict. They don't have language like us, but they're smart. They know how to form alliances, and they know that sometimes you have to form alliances, and they know the rules of that. They don't get hung up. And then they know when you've got to assert yourself, when you've got to sort of, get your own way. They know how to do that as well. And something else that they're very, very good at is getting over conflict. I had this little cabin up in the mountains in a forest, and sometimes I'd be woken up and it would sound like this war had broken out, because I'd have 40 huge baboons like roaring at each other, crashing through the forest, running over the roof of this little cabin, bang, 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 all of this noise going on. And they're just having a disagreement. And then 2 minutes later, everything's settled down. They're fine. They're just getting on with their day.
And you're fine too, right?
I wasn't in their hierarchy. So there was no reason to kind of get involved with it. They were just few incidents. On one occasion, I was sitting near a baby baboon, and another teenager came along and started bullying the baby. And the baby started screaming. And the mother looked up and she thought it was me that was causing the baby to scream. And she came at me. That was a little bit of a scary moment. But fortunately, she realized what was going on. And I was going, no, it was him.
Now, did you have kids, family at the time, or was it just you?
No, I didn't.
Throughout your education, I'm curious, did you always have a vision that you would be working with professional athletes? Was it always a thought or goal of yours?
That's a very important question. because my dreams have come true. In terms of my professional dreams, if you had said to me when I was 16 years old, what is your ultimate dream? I probably would have described what it is that I do now. And that doesn't always happen. It doesn't happen to everyone. And 12 years ago, I was working as a psychologist in a small city in South Africa, and I had a small practice out of the back room of my house. And I thought I was doing good work. I was doing my best, but I couldn't see an opportunity to kind of break through into somewhere where I wanted to work. And what people don't want me to say is that I believe a significant part of how this came to be was just good fortune. But I think I do have to acknowledge that in some ways I was lucky. In other ways, I was prepared. But I did have to say to myself at the time, if I never get a break, if this is all my life ever is, working with my own private practice out of the back room of my house, I'm going to have to be content with it. And I do think that's important. That I think it's important because I just think it's important that when you dream about the future, you don't only dream about one possible future. There can't just be one thing that's going to make you happy.
That's some good advice there. To find fulfillment in an actual career too is more than just an actual, I want to work with Chelsea or a certain team. Totally agree.
I think that is so important. And the other lesson that I'm very grateful is I've spoken to people who've won the biggest prizes, and it doesn't make as much of a difference as you would.
Yeah.
And I'm very, very grateful for that lesson. A guy who's won a World Cup, well, so what?
Yeah.
Like when we haven't done it, we think, if only that will change everything. Doesn't.
That's true. Well, that brings me to the point. You said some of it was fortune, some of it you prepared. I know that you had to take a plane to get to London, but how did it all unfold? Did you know someone?
And this kind of illustrates the kind of chain of events. So the chain of events basically was I had a friend in Durban and this friend was treating a Durban tennis player who ended up playing doubles with an Indian tennis. And that gave this Durban physio, this friend of mine, a connection to India. And he ended up getting a squash player to work with me. And then from the squash player, I ended up working with a marksman. And this marksman went on to win a gold medal at the Olympic Games. And in the course of preparing for the Olympic Games, he and I went to a competition in Milan. And in Milan, I met the psychologist of AC Milan. And 4 months after I met him, the psychologist was offered a job at Chelsea, and he asked me to come with him. So random,
Yes, very random.
I met someone at AC Milan, kind of got his own lucky break, and he asked me.
And what was your first thought when he said, come on through?
Well, he phoned me up, he phoned me up a couple of months after I'd met him. I mean, we spent the day together. We had a great time, I could spend hours talking about him. An amazing, amazing person. He was the European karate champion.
Who's that person?
His name is Bruno de Michaelis.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Bruno. Yeah. Okay. So when you told him you'd come along, what was the conversation like with your family? Because knowing this is going to be a whole change in your day-to-day life in South Africa.
My family are Manchester United fans, so there was some consternation.
Yeah, are you sure?
Yes, it was that. There's this great race in South Africa called the Comrades Marathon. It's an ultra marathon. And this friend of mine ran it a few times, and he went for a training run along the road. And he said he thought to himself, I've run this road enough. And he was just feeling like he was ready for a new challenge in life. And he moved to New Zealand, and that was his direction. And I'd also kind of got to the stage where I just thought I'd like to try something new.
Well, since you've been at Chelsea, and I know that you have kind of worked your way up to now kind of be the head of the psychology and sports science department, I'm curious, what is a day like for you? Like a day of practice, and then also take me through, what do you do during the game? I know it sounded like you kind of get to chill during the game since you've done all your work, but take me through it.
Well, I think when it comes to sports science, there's some people who take a very high-tech approach, that they use artificial intelligence to try and detect patterns and predict, whether somebody's going to get injured or not, or whether somebody's going to perform. Whereas what I prefer to do is just take a much more common sense approach. And I think really, as long as people are not doing too much or too little, as long as we can keep people within normal boundaries, that's really what we're trying to do. So we just try to have a system where we can keep tabs on what every single individual is doing. And then we try to use common sense. I think when it comes to sports science, I think sometimes people overcomplicate it. Mm-hmm. And for me, the challenge of sports science is having all of the information at your fingertips, but using that information to then make a common sense decision. So a lot of the decisions that we're making are made by people in groups having conversation. We're not using algorithms, we're not using artificial intelligence, we're not using, fancy programs to tell us what to do. We want to have the information, we want to look at the information, and then it's 4 people in a group, it's 6 people in a group saying, does this person need more or less? Should this player, should he be sprinting today, or should he be relaxing?
Yeah.
And we do find, I think that sometimes, and I'm not talking about, any particular sport, but I think when you're a professional involved in a sport, sometimes there's a temptation to almost justify your own existence. And sometimes you can have the temptation to do stuff because it's going to make you look smart, or it's going to make you look useful, or make you look busy. And I think is really important is every single intervention you do with an athlete, you should be asking yourself the question, do I really need to be making this intervention? And often less is more. And I do believe in common sense rather than kind of the secret sauce.
That really brings me to the point because, so many people look at Premier League clubs and say, man, they have all the great technology. Of course, they have to be the healthiest people. But you just kind of even talked about how it's not just technology. And at times you kind of see the person have these conversations. But at times, are you having separate sessions with athletes to understand their psychological mindset? And what does a meeting, if you have those, look like?
In relation to this particular question, I'd rather not talk about the work I do at Chelsea.
Yeah.
But, I can
maybe just in general.
In general, I could use examples from other sporting environments where, for example, working with a cricket team or working with the Saudis, for example. I'll take cricket as an example. And cricket is a great example because I spent some time there and I had conversations with players about anything from being homesick to a very specific skill execution. So there's quite a wide range of conversations that you could end up having with a player. But what I would also say is that, once again, I think a lot of these conversations are common sense conversations. And
well, when you say common sense conversations, explain that for people to really understand.
What I would say, first of all, is I think professionals, I think when you're having a conversation with an athlete, you should have a little word count in your head of how many words you've said and how many words the athlete has. If you have said more words than the athlete, I think this conversation is kind of going in the wrong direction. So that would, if I had one thing to say to people about speaking to athletes, it would be, I think you should be doing more listening than talking. And I think when you are listening, that is when it becomes a common sense conversation, because you can kind of understand what it is that the athlete is actually saying and what they need. And often what athletes need is more simple, because they might need more rest, they might need, a more structured day, or they might need more of a specific kind of training. But I don't really believe in magic tricks or secret sessions or particular routines, or I'm a little skeptical of that.
Yeah. And when you provide a listening ear to the athletes, you also have to kind of create that safe space for them to have those difficult conversations. How do you do that?
I think a lot of it is just showing that you are prepared to listen. To go back to that word count, I think when an athlete feels like they're being listened to, and I would say that goes across whether you're a physio, a psychologist, a sports scientist, a coach. I just think that holds true across so many of our disciplines.
I am curious though, because when athletes are struggling, and many athletes can know whether they're doing well within a team, their performance. For you, how tough is it for you also to still reassure them that they're doing well, even though they may not be playing, they may not be where they want to be? What goes through your mind before you have those conversations with the athlete to maybe help their mindset?
Wow. Great question, and very important question. What I'm trying to do, and this goes back to the notion of positive psychology, the work of Martin Seligman, which has been a big influence on how I kind of see the world and the work that I do. And a big part of positive psychology is the notion that we're trying to perceive the world accurately. I'm not trying to perceive the world optimistically or pessimistically. I'm trying to see the world as it is. And if there is something that an athlete is getting wrong, I don't want to be reassuring him. I want him to perceive what it is that he's doing wrong. If there's something that he's doing right, I want him to know that as well. And I also want him to bear in mind the wrongs and the right. I want him to be able to keep those in perspective. And for me, that is a really important thing, is when I have perspective, I'm able to tell an athlete what it is that they're doing wrong. Mm-hmm. Because chances are he's doing 99 things right and one thing wrong. And if I can tell him that, look, this is 1 out of 100, but it's still worth paying attention to, it doesn't then become a big deal. It doesn't become crushing. But that is what I'm trying to do, is really give the athlete realistic and accurate feedback about his or her performance. And I'm trying to help them perceive their performance in that accurate, realistic way.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said that, they could be doing 99% right, that 1% wrong. And so many high level athletes, it's some of the, like, they're not major things that stick out that, hey, they're doing this wrong. And I know with the sports medicine team there, you guys have GPS, thermography, different things to assess where an athlete is at. What type of data or assessments do you use to even find the slightest things that could help an athlete's performance?
Yeah, well, just yesterday, I went to the Mercedes-Benz Formula One team headquarters. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it was an incredible experience, to go into the places where they build the cars. And
where was that
at? It's near Silverstone, just kind of north of London.
Oh, okay.
And I mean, these cars are incredible pieces of engineering, and the amount of data that they gather. So when they have a race, they have probably, I mean, this sounds crazy, but I think it's true. I think they have 40 engineers watching one car.
Wow.
So they're taking data, so much data out of a single car, that they've got 40 engineers, each sitting there with a computer, 3 screens, then they're all in a room which has got another 10 screens in the front of the room, all looking after one car. In the human sports, we can't do that. We don't have that amount of resources to devote to data. So we tend to rely much more on intuition and feeling and some kind of rules of thumb or some expert intuition. And that's what we have to go for. Mm-hmm. And particularly when I was working with Olympic sports, and in fact, I'm not an elite athlete. I'm not, whenever I have a conversation with an athlete, I'm not the authority on the sport. The athlete is. And even in my own sport of squash, which I played for, a long time.
So you're a pro by now?
Well, no.
No, I'm kidding.
I know the sport and I love the sport. And I do work with a couple of world-class squash players. But even in this sport, which I know so well, when I work with them, they're the expert. So I think part of feedback is not me just telling the athlete what I think. It's part of me kind of trying to guide them to review their own performance accurately.
I see. Yeah. And on another note, you did give a keynote speech, I can't remember where, about the use of the biofeedback, neurofeedback in sports that assessed, I think, over 250 athletes and kind of broke down some physiological data. And you all found that there were four different qualities that set some of the elite athletes. I think it was resilience, alertness, control, and flexibility. I guess for those athletes, what type of training do they do differently than their counterparts to get to such a high level?
I think the one kind of training that all athletes should do is some form of self-awareness training involving breathing. Now, there are different ways of doing it. You can do it with biofeedback where you're monitoring your psychophysiology. You can do it as a form of meditation, which would probably be the two extremes. But I think whatever it is that you do, it's very important to train yourself in breathing and to train yourself in physical self-awareness as you breathe.
And what do you mean by that?
What I mean is that within our nervous system, we have a parasympathetic nervous system and a sympathetic nervous system. And the one makes us more alert and the other calms us. So when we breathe in, we naturally become more alert. So if I'm trying to arouse myself or wake myself up or get myself ready to do something big, I'm going to go and I'm going to breathe in. And it may be necessary, if I'm picking up a big weight or about to run through a wall or something like that, I need to sort of get hyped up. But if I'm executing a more kind of skill-based activity, I may need to calm myself down. And that's going to involve an exhalation.
Mm-hmm.
And the fascinating thing about exhaling is that when I exhale, it's almost like I open up the communication channels to my own body. And you can even try this right now, is that if you just take a breath in and then slowly start to breathe out, and as you breathe out, just reflect on the physical sensations that you can begin to feel. Reflect on the sensations of sitting in the chair. Reflect on the sensations of whatever muscle tension there may be. Reflect on the sensations of your feet touching the ground. Reflect on the sensations of holding your head upright. And then when you breathe in, observe how those sensations become less vivid. And then as you exhale again, it really connects you back into your own body. So that exhalation phase is this, it's like opening a window into your internal world.
Mm-hmm.
And I would really encourage all athletes to become practiced in that process of being able to be aware of what's happening inside them.
Yeah, that's
And
good.
that does involve breathing training, and there's no way around it. So, I'm not given to kind of definitive statements,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm fairly confident in the idea that all athletes should practice breathing and self-awareness.
Now, the breathing training, do you think that athletes should first see someone that is trained in that to get a good understanding first before they kind of do that on their own?
Yeah, the funny thing is that it's not rocket science, and I'm a little skeptical because I don't like to take this breathing thing too far. I don't want to make it mystical, or I don't want to make it magical, and I don't want to say there's only one way to do it. I like it to be as simple and common sense as possible. And what I would be a little wary of is that, you go and find somebody who claims to be sort of the only expert and they know everything. And, I really want to steer clear of those kinds of people.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's nice if you can learn a little bit from someone, without having to discover it all by yourself. But I think there are lots of, I'm sure there'll be lots of YouTube videos and
Now, on that note, with kind of those techniques, but that study I referred to earlier also found the reserves, they were more stressed than anyone. What type of things do you all kind of give them to help them get through that stress level? And maybe if you do know, why do you think they face so much stress?
before I moved to Chelsea, I was in the wellness industry, and our clients were a couple of major banks in South Africa. And when it came to stress, we asked people two questions. The one was, are you stressed? And the second question was, do you believe you have the skills to cope with the stress that you? And what we were really trying to find out was, are people able to cope? And do people feel like they have the resources to deliver on what it is that they feel that they need to do? And I think whether you're a reserve team footballer, and I mean, it was exactly the same when I worked in cricket, for example. It's tough to be on the outside. It's tough when you're not being selected. That's kind of a challenge all of its own. And in some ways, when I was a psychologist in private practice, I hadn't sort of achieved the dream that I wanted to achieve. That was stressful too, because you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, I haven't got everything I want, and I'm not sure what I have to do to get it. And that is an inherently difficult situation. And I think I can give a useful answer to that question, because what we're talking about is we're talking about a scenario, and for sure you could say this applies to reserve team footballer, reserve team cricketer, but it applies to all of us as well. Is that we all find ourselves in situations where we're not getting what we want, and we're wondering what we can do about it. And Martin Seligman says, when we're in that kind of stressful situation, there are three questions that we have to ask. The one is, how much of this is because of me, and how much of this is because of circumstances? And that is a very important question, because if it is all about me, it means I've got to take action. I've got to do something. And the stress would be useful because the stress is going to kick my backside and get me motivated. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if it's circumstantial, the stress is not useful because there's actually nothing that I can do. So if the situation is circumstantial, then my strategy is actually acceptance, that I need to accept that situation. And this is what I said to myself when I was 37 years old, doing a job that was not my dream job, was, I believe at this point, I'm doing everything I can. So the fact that it has not happened is circumstantial. Mm-hmm. So my job then is acceptance. My job is not to fight or to change or to worry or to stress. It's to accept.
Yeah. And since you have been at Chelsea, I'm sure there are still some stressful moments. Are these techniques you even still use for yourself, or do you even find yourself stressed with how long you've been in this field?
I mean, I work with human beings, so, and I work as part of a group. So in that way, I'm sure what I do has a lot of in common with, what everybody else does. And I think in any group situation, you have different opinions, and with different opinions, there's a certain amount of kind of challenge to resolve that. But I think if you can, and something I try and do is remind myself that different opinions are a positive thing, and, try and welcome different opinions. And that's something that I have to remind myself of, because my kind of default position is, I just wish everybody agreed with me all the time. That would be my preference, is if mm-hmm. that kind of happened. But I have to remind myself that actually I don't know everything, and that when someone comes with a different opinion, it's quite possible that they're going to be improving my knowledge of the world. And so, yeah, it doesn't kind of come naturally to me, but that is something that I try and remind myself of.
Yeah. Now I'm curious for your team, you all have practice, but for medical professionals, it always seems like they are coming in hours early before to get things ready. How early are you coming in, and how many hours would you say? I know it's sometimes hard to say, would you log in a week? Are you working every single day? Do you have a day off? Tell me what that's like, so people get a realistic understanding.
I don't have days off. Yeah, it's pretty much full on. We have 2 matches a week. You got to review every match. You got to be prepared for every next match, and you got to train in between. Mm-hmm. It's pretty full on. When I was at Mercedes-Benz yesterday, they said they used to have a culture. They've got a team that they call the build team. So these are the guys that put the car together. They don't design the car and they don't make the car, but once all the bits are there, they put all the bits together. And they had a culture of working 15 hours a day for 2.5 months without a day off. That was there. And they said if you did that, then you would get the little badge of honor.
But you don't get a badge of honor for working every day.
Yeah. And then the guy who was the head of that group has now turned into the culture advisor, and are looking for a more sort of healthy way of doing things.
Yeah. Well, what's your role while practice is going on? Are you just watching players' behaviors, or do you have other data, things that you have to assess?
So we monitor the activity of the players, and it just comes back to that common sense thing of we don't just want to go on the data. You don't just want to look at a number and go, that's too big or that's too small. You want to speak to the player. You want to have a sense of what the player is doing. You want to watch the player. How does he look? It's quite useful in winter because everybody's breath comes out as steam, so you can tell how fast people are breathing. That's quite a handy one. Mm-hmm. And then you've got data as well, and you're trying to make a common sense decision.
Basically. I'm curious about your thoughts of what it takes to thrive in such a fast-paced environment. What has helped you within Chelsea? Because you've kind of it seems that you've obtained higher positions within this same club. What skill set has helped you?
I think you have to collaborate. You've got to work with people, and I think it's really important to respect the people around you. And I think that's something I've got better at as I've got older. My first job I had for 6.5 years. I had that from when I was in my late 20s to my mid 30s. And I was younger than I am now. And I think one of the things I learned from that job and tried to apply in this collaboration is really important. Trying to see things from the other person's perspective and try to understand the skill and the professionalism and the kind of commitment of the other person, and just try to see where they're coming from, and even when mistakes get made, or people don't do things, try to understand their maybe their anxieties or their weaknesses as well, but to do that in a compassionate way.
Mhm. And that understanding, is that what inspired you to publish your book, 10 Rules for Talking, last year?
I suppose so. It was me trying to put down some of what I've learned, because I came into this world, like I said at the beginning, it was a big culture shock,
Mhm.
and I had to adapt.
About your book, and you talked about two things need to happen when you are communicating. You need to communicate safety, and you both need to have some kind of shared understanding of the world. How did you come to learn that? Was it through your personal experiences, or were you diving into different research?
I think, first of all, there are some amazing books on communication.
Hmm.
And there's some super experts out there on communication. But what I've found is that these super experts tend to focus more on the emotional safety side of conversation. In order to have safe conversations, it's important that we have mutual respect. It's important that if conversations get overheated, we've got some techniques to cool them down again. And it's important that we feel that our agendas are respected or acknowledged. That's when a conversation is safe. But in addition to that, you need a conversation to be rigorous. And this was the second part, is that we're trying to achieve this shared understanding of the world. Because it's no good if I say to you, well, I don't believe in vaccines, and you're going to me, you do believe in vaccines, and uh, and then we go, well, well, as long as we respect each other, it's all okay. Well, it actually isn't. It's important that we achieve some kind of shared understanding of the world, or you believe in global warming, I don't, or vice versa, or whatever. It's not okay that we just accept that we don't see eye to eye on some of these crucial issues. It is actually important that we try to work towards a shared understanding of the world. And,
I
and
see.
so that's the second part of communication that I think is critical and doesn't get discussed as often, is that we need to have access to critical thinking tools and rigorous thinking tools that will allow us to not get you to agree with me or me to agree with you. It's that we both collaborate, we become a team, that as soon as we discover a difference of opinion between us, we actually become a team, and we work together, try and find that third position, which is not 100% what I think and not 100% of what you think. It's a third place where we both educate each other, we both learn something new, we both share, and we both reach a new place where
Yeah.
hopefully we're closer together.
And I think that that skill is beneficial for any career. It's not even just working with the sports team, it's relating to people at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, I wanted the book to apply kind of more widely.
Just three questions for future sports psychologists. So, in the States, you typically need to obtain a higher degree to work. Well, really, just to get a job, to be quite frank. Do you
Sure.
think that it's necessary to have more than a bachelor's degree to work in the Premier League? Or if you can show that you're passionate, you're knowledgeable, you can get there?
I'd say it's so individual. I think experience is very, very important. So for sure, you will need some kind of qualification, but you also need experience. And experience is gained by often starting at the beginning. And I do so many times get letters from people asking me for a job, and they're like, "Well, I'm straight out of university, and I really want to do this and that. Please, can I have a job?" And I'm thinking, well, I didn't start at the top. I put in the years,
Mhm.
and I put in the years, sort of accepting that I may never get the lucky break that I eventually got. And I found a way to be happy before I got the lucky break. And, I would encourage people in that as well.
Yeah. Now, Chelsea, you all had interns. There was one specifically, Matt Hallman. He was an intern for Chelsea and he impressed you. And at this time, you weren't the director of Chelsea, but when a job presented itself, you mentioned his name and he ended up being there. What qualities did you see in him at such an early stage to know that he'd be able to handle the rigor of a Premier League environment?
I'd rather not talk about him individually.
Okay, not individual, but what about a quality that you
Yeah.
think people should have to thrive in your environment?
I think people have got to be prepared to work hard, and work really hard. That is something, in some of these environments, it's more a case of what's it going to take than what am I prepared to put in. And then I think people have got to be prepared to be rigorous and to question themselves. That's also important. And when you're prepared to question yourself, you're going to learn. And then, like I said, you've got to be able to get on with people.
Okay, lastly, what is the best advice you could give anyone to manage their mental state, whether they're a doctor, a teacher, athlete? Give me your best.
I'll tell you 3 things.
Okay.
Number 1, you have to be able to correct yourself. What I mean by that is you've got to have some kind of feedback loop where your emotional responses are subject to correction. Something may happen and I get angry, something that may happen, I get anxious, something may happen, I get happy. And I've got to be able to reflect on that emotion and moderate it in some way, because maybe I'm more anxious than I need to be. And I need to be able to correct that emotion and drop it down. Maybe I'm not anxious enough. There's some situations where we need to be more worried about something because that anxiety is going to kick my backside and get me to do some work. So that would be the number 1 thing is I've got to be able to correct my emotions and I've got to be able to reflect on my emotions. The second one would be I've got to learn to accept it, that some things can't be changed or they can't be changed right now. And I've got to know when to just go, okay, I take it, and I'll just kind of move on from that. And the third thing I would say is our bodies and our physical well-being is extremely important to our mental well-being. And we have to look after ourselves physically.
That's good. Tim, anytime I have a psychologist that's a guest, I always feel refreshed, like I've just been dipped in water and I'm alive again. So thank you so much. And maybe one day our paths will cross.
Possibly, yeah. We can go for surf.
Yeah. Well, have a great day. Thanks so much, Tim.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. Now, be sure that you rate and you download and give me your thoughts.